I Could Have Been a Contender, written by Thomas Cookson, published on the 23rd of 6/13. For the Caves of Androzani, the most frequent counter I'm faced with when I write off the J&T era is how I can dismiss Caves of Androzani, let alone wish for a world where it never got made. Well, I can't debunk Caves of Androzani. Unlike most 80s stories that are elevated to greatness based on seriously diminished expectations, like the Happiness Patrol, which gets championed by a right-on cultish movement, convinced the rest of fandom is too narrow-minded to appreciate such a good-natured story where the doctor murders someone's pet dog, Caves really is every bit as brilliant and near impossible to fault or debunk as fandom unanimously claims. However, an element of distortion needs addressing. The gulf of quality between this and the next story became almost mythological, and Caves became erroneously viewed as concluding the last golden age, and even as the unbreachable gate, protecting all that preceded it from the corrosive awfulness that followed. But Caves was an anomalous fluke of an otherwise rotten era. Fans try to claim the show was still doing something right, but the pointless bloodshed of Warriors of the Deep and resurrection of the Daleks was meant to be tragically pointless and to reckon with a moral malaise, rather than exaggerate and bloat it. We know the rot set in earlier, but we refuse to believe the fall happened until after Davison's departing high note. Whilst it's impossible to imagine the show without Genesis of the Daleks or City of Death, I can imagine the series existing fine without Caves of Androzani, and I'm feeling no less complete for it. Perhaps the show already was complete by City of Death, if not by the Seeds of Doom, but whilst the show could happily exist without Caves, the Davison era absolutely couldn't. Seen in hindsight, the Daleks' master plan would be a far better, more appropriate regeneration story for Hartnell. Likewise, State of Decay or Horror of Fang Rock would be a better exit for Tom Baker than Logopolis. Nothing else in Davison's era would work as a regeneration story. Only Resurrection of the Daleks comes close, and it's a mess. That Caves is the only viable cap-off to Davison's era is rather a damning indictment of the era. In fact, the Davison era frequently produced what can be called anti-quality. While its Death to the Daleks or Creature from the Pit are fairly rubbish, if they were deleted from history, something would feel missing from their respective seasons. But the opposite is true of Time Flight or Warriors of the Deep, which have no context in being, and whole seasons would feel much improved and would amount to more without their existence. So the era would feel incomplete without its final story, yet ironically the show would feel more complete without the Davison era existing at all, or if the show ended halfway through on Enlightenment or The Visitation. Is Caves of Androzani needed to affirm the Doctor's selfless, determined nobility and heroic nature that we've seen so many times before? Ordinarily no, but the 80s saw some of the most ugly, dishonourable and unforgivable characterization of the Doctor, and in that context his nobility needed to be reasserted. Resultantly, Caves of Androzani tips fan opinion of Davison overwhelmingly into gushing praise. Fandom was already conned into mistaking Davison's depressingly limited characterization for integrity, but Caves of Androzani elevated Davison's Doctor to a greatness he was otherwise unworthy of. The Davison era was simply fan propaganda, made for fans who are writing propaganda about the show in the fanzines of the time that J&T took keen interest in. Tegan existed to say that the show now has strong feminist female companions. The bickering scenes she has with Adric are there to say, this is all a serious drama show now. Davison is characterized impotently to say, this Doctor is different to Tom Baker, and stories like Warriors of the Deep somewhere along the line stopped even being a story, and became instead a particularly obnoxious and crass piece of propaganda telling fans what to think. This is why Davison's era feels so soulless and heartless. Propaganda is almost never about empathy. Quite the contrary, it's about simplifying, glorifying, or vilifying. It's also self-perpetuating, and there's no concept of quality control, even while it's claiming to be itself be a new era of quality control. Propaganda exists for mass production. Sometimes propaganda actually is anti-art, like how Nazism benefited from the moral panic about jazz music, which explains Warriors of the Deep's lunatic fringe, and sadly Caves of Androzani winds up being part of that propaganda too. Like Earthshock, this story galvanized fans to embrace the Davison era as a whole, warts and all, by drawing such an emotional high from the era's journey, conning fans into seeing a tragic hero in the Fifth Doctor, and even into thinking that there was a hero's journey to the era. Overall, the only hero's journey there was to Davison's Doctor was a regressive one, the hero's journey in reverse. When I first watched this story, it truly was a glorious, beautiful, noble self-sacrifice of the Fifth Doctor, the tragic tale of a decent man in an indecent time. But it isn't. Sure, we may remember Davison's futile determination during the final episode in the same breath as his mad rush to save Hadric, or his deciding enough is enough and preparing to kill Davros. But sadly, Warriors of the Deep exists, showing him up as a snidey, reprehensible bad risk, incapable of honouring anyone or anything but the most genocidal, a hero who protests his innocence before setting off the base's reactor, who is partly responsible for letting the Merca break through, didn't even warn anyone that it would electrocute them on contact, withheld information on a weapon that could have saved everyone's lives, and shouts down anyone left alive who suggests using it, then breaks his promise to a diseased Preston that he'd return to save Vorshak by reviving the very Silurian who'd held him hostage and who consequently kills him. Quite love how the story's apologists highlight how that last point demonstrates the Doctor's belief in the preservation of life, always taking precedence even over the preservation of life. In that context, the Doctor sacrificing himself to save Peri here is the least he could do after not only getting her into this in the first place, but also sacrificing everyone else on the sea base for his lunatic pacifist principles that he eventually didn't even uphold. This story may be about shady humans who won't give Davison a chance and keep stabbing him in the back, but in context of Warriors of the Deep, they're rightly not giving him a chance to do them all dirty, fun, reasonable motives first. So why does Caves of Androzani work? Well, because Robert Holmes wrote it. Doesn't entirely cover it, but it is crucial. The best Saywood-era stories were usually written furthest away from the unpleasant, volatile production environment. Barbara Clegg's enlightenment seemed to be inspired and rattled off quickly, without feeling rushed. Revelation of the Daleks was written on holiday, and Caves of Androzani was written by a returning old hand who distanced himself from the show since. The following year, Holmes was more part of the team, and wrote The Two Doctors, which demonstrated how much working under J&T brought out more sour grapes in his writing than even the Sun Grape makers. What hurt the show was the team trying too hard through lack of faith in what they had. Eric thought the show was becoming staid pantomime, and as J&T wouldn't let him do his job of finding better writers, so Eric kept overcompensating for weak scripts with vulgar overstatement and shock tactics. The show was put together by someone with no faith in it, but this script was worth being confident about. Most of the time, J&T's demands of what goes into the story and his limitations on the Doctor's character led to the show feeling morally seriously out of balance. Starting on Logopolis, the first slapped-together story, with Nyssa, Tegan, and the Master forced into it, a story full of wanton cruelty that goes unstopped by a marginalised, neutered protagonist, it effectively spearheaded the next several years of sloppy writing and appalling characterisation. J&T's insistence on the soap setup and dramatic histrionics particularly felt off balance. Season 19 presented mind parasites, nightmare sequences, and aliens causing the Black Death, yet it's the soap scenes of Tegan and Adric shrieking at one another that leave the viewer wondering what the hell is happening and why. Here, for the first time since Keeper of Traken, everything feels in balance. The Doctor and Peri work perfectly as a duo, and giving Davison only one companion to rescue gives him a single task to focus on, rather than him having to manage or drop several, i.e. deciding to go kill Davros and then chickening out. The characters and conflict created all have a purpose in being. Nothing is included gratuitously in a way that feels unneeded. Nothing feels either underwritten a la Ford of Doomsday or overwritten a la Resurrection of the Daleks. Everything's just right. Everything's poetically polarized by binary opposition, from cold, understated Morgus to the volatile, furious Jack. As such, the Doctor's noble nature and innocence has something to shine and react against by the beauty of contrast. Even Stott's man refusing any price to brave the final mud baths emphasizes how far the Doctor will go to save Peri's life. Likewise, the Shakespearean bloodbath is in balance. Thus, the theatrical soliloquizing and the gun battles work in unison without jarring. Compared with Warriors, where the Doctor's Hamlet-esque moral hesitation becomes brutally, tastelessly gay-crashed by an action-revenge moment with Preston's killing, only because the former contrived to allow the latter to happen, meaning these elements tarnish and disgrace each other, like if Nyder had shot Sarah in the back halfway through the Do I Have the Right scene. Here, Jack's rants about the evils of Morgus or Stotts actually are narratives in themselves, which complement rather than sabotage the momentum in the story's driving passions. In Warriors, even when the story reaches the logical narrative point where sympathy for the wronged avenging villains is lost, the Doctor's dialogue angrily tries to guilt the viewer into feeling sympathy again. But Jack demonstrates his nobler sympathetic nature without needing the Doctor to forcibly tell us so, in contradiction to everything that's on screen. When his mask is unpeeled, Chellak's determined campaign to breach the defences sees him horrified by what he discovers and going into retreat and his death. Likewise, seeing Jack cowering like a wounded animal after Peri screams at the side of him is a genuinely heartbreaking moment. The momentum makes it all the more sad when the illness finally catches up with the Doctor and he has to give up and take it lying down. A burst of life making a crippling death all the more tragic. I don't buy fandom's reading on Davison's Doctor as a tragic victim, not when he did others so dirty and held on to his impotence like a grudge, yet there's something satisfyingly championable about his kicking ass here, even when he fiercely grips a laughing Salatine by the shoulders. An underdog coming up, fighting back against all odds, a victim not of circumstances or adversity, but of reprehensible writing, degrading and character assassinating him, but finally here getting the strong writing he always deserved, proving what he's capable of. Frustratingly, this is exactly how he should have been written from the start. Caves shouldn't have been how it ended. It's the note his era should have begun on. Sadly, it was never allowed to have an impact on the show. It should have turned things around for the series' direction, but ended up not making a scrap of difference. It might as well not have happened.